Are public employees paid too much? Not enough. Do they need special protections that we in the private sector don't have? That's what the protesting across the country has been all about. But take a look at this chart, which shows that private sector workers are 3 times more likely to quit their jobs than state and local government workers. Here with us to explain why this is proof that government workers are paid too much is Dan Mitchell, Cato Institute Senior Fellow. Dan, it's a pleasure. Welcome back. I have to tell you that I was quite surprised when I saw that chart. So the question is, if government jobs are so bad, why do so many people leave them?
The data is pretty clear on total compensation. Federal workers make twice as much as people in the productive sector of the economy, and state and local government workers make about 45% more than people in the private sector. But the unions have always argued, well, but that's because we're higher educated, we have tougher, more demanding jobs, and you have to factor all those things out. So I went to the Department of Labor, and I found this so-called JOLT study, which deals with how often people leave or are fired from jobs. And you can find what's called the voluntary departure rate. And if government jobs were really underpaid compared to the private sector, you would think that people would be more likely to voluntarily leave government jobs to get supposedly higher paying jobs in the private sector. But it's just the opposite. You're 3 times more likely to leave a job if you're in the private sector because you're looking for higher pay. But if you have one of these comfortable government jobs with these lavish pensions and incredible fringe benefits, you burrow in like a tick.
All right, so when you say that the private sector is paid less than government sector, you're talking about for comparable work. A personal assistant, a secretary, a receptionist, even a janitor in the private sector versus comparable work in the public sector. How did it get that way? Was it unions that bamboozled Republicans and Democrats? Was it presidents who bamboozled members of Congress? Was it both parties? How did we suddenly realize that we've created a monster to the point where people in Wisconsin, the teachers union, ate and slept in the state house for 2 weeks rather than allowing the legislature to meet because they thought it might make them pay for their benefits?
I think we're looking at 2 factors that are important. One, a lot of states for decades were giving their employees, government employees, very generous pay packages, but the thing where they really shoveled the money out the door was for the pensions, was for the retirement benefits, the health benefits, and all these bills that have been accumulated over the decades are now coming due, and states like Wisconsin and other states are really facing a giant long-term fiscal challenge because of all these unfunded promises that were made to these very lavishly compensated government workers. But then the other problem, and this is more the systemic process problem, how on earth can you have a interest group that is one of the biggest contributors to political campaigns negotiating with the very politicians that they give money to? It's an inherently corrupt process where you don't have anybody representing the taxpayers.
Right. I mean, that is really reprehensible that workers get to choose their employer. And of course, if the governor happens to have a personal relationship with the head of the union, as was the case in New Jersey before Chris Christie was the governor, then it's even more reprehensible, but nobody complains about it. Dan, thank you so much for bringing this study to our attention. We appreciate it, truly. If President Obama were the CEO of a company, let's call it America Inc., would he be fired? America Inc. is headed for bankruptcy. So how would a Wall Street turnaround expert look at this mess? Next.
Invest in innovation, invest in high-speed rail and high-speed internet, invest in education. Now, these investments are an essential part of the budget my administration is sending to Congress, because I'm convinced that if we outbuild and out-innovate and out-educate, as well as out-hustle the rest of the world, the jobs and industries of our time will take root here in the United States.
So President Obama wants to invest more. That's big government speak for spend more. If President Obama were the CEO of a company, let's call it America Inc., would he be fired? My next guest worked for President Reagan and says President Obama is operating like a clueless CEO of a company that's about to go bust. And if he doesn't get out of this state of denial, our country is headed for catastrophe. Joining me now, former Assistant Secretary of Labor and the author of Win One for the Shareholders, my friend Al Angrisani. Al, welcome here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Judge.
I mean, how could any private entity have as its CEO a president like President Obama or a Congress like we had in the past 2 years, which basically wants to look the other way and forget that that $14 trillion debt is even there?
Well, that's classic behavior in a company that's going bankrupt. And what you have is a CEO, leader, who basically punts on all the big issues, and the board goes into a state of denial until the bank cuts them off.
All right, the bank can't cut them off because the bank would go to jail to cut them off. The bank is the taxpayers, and they will send the IRS to force us to pay money even if it's going down a rat hole. What will it take for this board of directors, the Congress, and this CEO, the president, to get out of their state of denial, recognize that we're teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and do something concrete and permanent about it?
The way I see things right now through my prism as a turnaround executive and the behavior that I see being exerted by the president and the Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, by the way, I believe it's going to take a crisis.
What kind of a crisis?
Well, the way
an inability of the government to pay its debt service?
The way this will probably play out is that you will see, and no one can see what's coming around the corner, but you will see a massive spike of interest rates driven by a collapse of the dollar. 25% of what we spend now in our budget goes to service debt.
Right.
If interest rates doubled, it would go to 50%. That would fundamentally strangle the government's ability to function.
And what would happen if the government couldn't meet its debt service? That is, if it couldn't pay the interest on the debt, and if it couldn't pay back the principal as it comes due because it couldn't borrow any more money because nobody would lend money to it?
Well, that's not an option because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and they'll print as much as they have to do.
At present.
At present.
Right.
That would drive massive inflation.
So Ben Bernanke will take care of this, although a loaf of bread will cost you $15.
Right. The Fed will print money, and you'll have Weimar Republic-like inflation.
All right. What should we do to prevent this disaster? What's the first thing Congress and the president should do? I don't think it's in their genetic makeup. It is with Scott Garrett, whom you heard earlier, and fiscal hawks in the Republican Party, but there are very few Democrats willing to recognize this problem, and there are some Republicans who won't recognize it.
They should do the same thing that I do when I go into a company that's about to go bankrupt and have to put a line in the sand and say no more, or the same thing that a governor like Governor Christie is doing in New Jersey where he said no more. Do not raise this debt limit.
Do not raise this debt limit.
Draw a line in the sand and say it's time to address the problem.
I think if Republicans vote to raise the debt limit, it'll be a generation again before they're in the majority, because the people that sent them there to stop the borrowing. Al Angrisani. By the way, the book is Win One for the Shareholders, if you want to know how these companies are turned around and how the government can do it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Judge.
There is a speech war against pro-life pregnancy clinics in New York City. Enraged City Councilman Dan Halloran is here to fight back. Next. Should a private organization be forced by the government to tell its customers about products it doesn't offer? That's exactly what the New York City Council wants to do. Listen to this. It's considering legislation that would force private pro-life medical clinics to tell their pregnant patients about abortion options. Options that, of course, pro-life clinics don't offer. This does not sit well with my next guest, who argues that such a requirement is a serious and profound violation of free speech rights by forcing a pro-choice message on a pro-life organization. Here now is Queens Republican City Councilman Dan Halloran. Congressman Halloran, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Judge,
I couldn't believe this when I saw it. What does the City Council of the City of New York and the mayor, who's an on-again, off-again, on-again, off-again Republican, really want to do?
Look, this bill will do three things. First, it will compel speech inside these crisis pregnancy centers. It will take not-for-profits who receive absolutely no funding, no money from the city or state of New York, and require them to put up signs that indicate they don't provide abortion services, they don't provide contraception, and they are not going to refer you to agencies or organizations that do. That's one.
Right.
Number two, it's going to create a criminal penalty that if you refuse to comply with the orders of the Department of Consumer Affairs in regards to this, you can be imprisoned up to 6 months for violating
This is
these
the
orders.
doctors and the nurses that run these clinics. The clinics we're talking about are places where women go for counseling and health services to have babies.
That's correct.
Not to abort the baby.
That's correct. These crisis pregnancy centers are designed around the model that everybody is pushing the agenda of abortion. And as you know, 41% of all pregnancies in New York City end in an abortion. In our minority communities, that number is 60%.
Wow.
60% of all pregnancies.
All right. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
That's
Every
right.
school child knows that line.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court has interpreted it to mean Congress can't force you to speak. It can't
right.
force you to defend yourself. It can't force you to utter words that you don't want to utter. So how does the City Council of the Big Apple claim that it can defy the First Amendment?
It doesn't care. And in fact, I pointed out, and at the hearings I pointed out, that a similar law in Maryland had been struck down by the federal courts there as unconstitutional for the very same reason. And that court was dealing with a much narrower issue. There was just signage in Maryland. Here, it's speech. If you pick up the phone at the pregnancy center, you have to tell them, we don't provide abortions, we don't provide referrals for birth control.
Is this a war on the pro-life movement in the city of New York by the abortionists who run the government?
It's a war against the not-for-profits who are in turn sponsored by many of our Christian organizations, whether it's the Catholic Church, the evangelical Christians. All of them are out there doing this without government funding again on the good works that they're doing. And we're being told, no, that's not good enough.
Well, how can the government wage war on a perfectly legitimate... Well, I mean, what could be more legitimate than an organization that raises tax-free dollars to care for the maternal health of poor women that want to deliver their babies? And the city of New York is trying to shut them down.
It's a twist of the argument. What they're trying to do is turn it on its head and call the people who are for these crisis pregnancy centers anti-women. You know, this is a typical tactic of speech they don't want out there. You know, it's great freedom of speech only so far as the speech that they like is being spoken.
I would think if this passes, and I guess it's probably going to pass. I mean, how many Republicans are with you on the City Council in New York?
Look, all 5 members of the Republican delegation are against this bill. But in addition to that, we've been joined by a nominal group of conservative Democrats who say this just goes too far. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be having a vote on Wednesday if the Speaker didn't feel she'd lined up the votes.
All right, so this passes on Wednesday. A federal judge will enjoin it on Thursday, I would suspect.
I know that several of these crisis pregnancy centers have already lined up legal counsel. They're talking about it. They're going to use the federal decision in Maryland as their basis. This is an assault on the First Amendment. This is an assault on separation of powers. This is the government telling a religious group what to do. And they tried to fake it. They said that people would be confused when they walked into these centers and think that they're about getting these other services. Bridge to Life, Sisters of Life. They're not confusing.
There's no
but Planned Parenthood provides no parenting services, and that's not confusing.
Dan Halloran, it's a pleasure to have you. You're always welcome here. Thanks very
Joe.
much. The Obamacare waiver madness is just beginning. In addition to companies and unions, states might be able to opt out of Obamacare too. Is this a sign that Obamacare itself is on cardiac arrest? My freedom fighters are on that one next.